Hello and welcome to Poop Food 10101. Thank you for joining us. Today we will be discussing ICE. We have compiled statistics on their job performance. Stay tuned.
Hey everyone, today we're diving into a really dramatic shift in U.S. immigration enforcement. And no, we're not talking about the border, we're talking about what's happening inside the country. The official data tells a pretty incredible story of scale and speed. So let's break down what's really going on.
So let's just start with this one number, 670,000. That's how many removals or deportations the Department of Homeland Security reported in just a single 12-month period. It's a massive, massive figure that signals a huge change in how things are done. And honestly, it's the hook for this entire story.
Okay, before we go any further, we have to clear something up, because it's super important. Immigration enforcement isn't just one thing. Most of us think of the border, right? That's Customs and Border Protection, or CBP. But our focus today is on ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And as you can see, their arrests happen inside the U.S. It's a totally different kind of enforcement.
First up, let's zoom out and just get a handle on the big picture. You really need to see the scale of this surge to believe it.
Just look at how fast this all happened. In fiscal year 2024, ICE made around 149,000 arrests. The very next year, that number is estimated to have more than doubled. This wasn't some slow, gradual increase. This was like hitting the accelerator, a massive operational ramp-up in a super short time.
And to put that big annual number into a daily context, by the end of 2025, things were moving so fast that ICE arrests were sometimes hitting over 1,000 people per day. That gives you a real sense of the pace of these operations happening all across the country. Okay, so we've established the sheer scale of the surge, but that just leads to an even more important question. Who exactly is being arrested? Because as you're about to see, the profile of the person being apprehended has changed a lot. Let's start with our baseline. Back in fiscal year 2024, things were split pretty much down the middle. About half of everyone ICE arrested had a prior criminal conviction, and the other half didn't. Simple enough. But then, look what happens in 2025. The whole picture just flips. Suddenly, the share of people with criminal convictions drops way down to 35%. And those with no criminal record, they now make up almost 2/3 of all arrests. This tells you the enforcement net got cast much, much wider. And that trend just keeps going into early 2026. At this point, nearly 3 out of every 4 people arrested by ICE are classified as non-criminal. What that means is their only violation is a civil immigration offense, not some other crime. This is a really fundamental change in who is being prioritized for enforcement. All right, so we've got the how many and the who. Now let's talk about the where. Because this surge in enforcement wasn't spread out evenly across the country. Not at all. It was actually heavily concentrated in just a few key spots. These 5 states really became the epicenters. Texas just led the pack in pure numbers. In California, you saw a lot of at-large arrests, which happen out in communities and workplaces, not in jails. And then in places like Florida, Georgia, and Tennessee, you saw this major ramp-up in activity, often fueled by more cooperation with local law enforcement. And this chart just drives that point home. I mean, if you look at where people are actually being held in detention, the numbers are just staggering. Texas alone is holding almost 18,000 people. That's more than the next 2 states, Louisiana and California, put together. So the big question is, how did this all happen on the ground? Well, this huge jump in arrests was driven by some very specific changes in tactics, and those changes put an absolutely immense amount of pressure on the entire detention system.
Just take a look at this timeline. The number of people in ICE detention basically exploded over the course of 2025. It kicked off the year at around 40,000 people. But by December, it had rocketed past 66,000, and it even peaked at over 68,000, which is an all-time record high for the agency.
But the impact of this enforcement push went beyond just direct arrests. At the same time all this was happening, DHS also reported that an estimated 2 million people self-deported in 2025. It's a phenomenon they said was a response to the announcements of stricter policies in the interior.
And that brings us to our final section. You know, when any system is forced to operate at this kind of scale and speed, it creates enormous strain. So now we're going to look at the data on oversight, the risks, and the consequences for everyone involved, from the people being detained to the agents out on the ground.
And here's where we see a critical tension. At the exact moment the system was taking in a record number of people, a key tool for accountability was actually shrinking. A report from the Project on Government Oversight really highlights this, pointing out that as operations scaled up, formal oversight inspections scaled way down.
The consequences of all that strain are pretty stark. In 2025, there was a record 32 deaths in ICE custody. That's a jump of nearly 300% from the year before, and it really reflects the intense pressure being put on the detention system's resources and its medical care.
But at the exact same time, the risks for the officers themselves skyrocketed. DHS reported a 1,300% increase in assaults against ICE agents during arrest attempts. It's a staggering number that just underscores how high stakes and dangerous this environment became for the agents who are carrying out these policies.
Now let's look at incidents that end up as formal complaints. You might look at the percentages here and think, wow, those are really small. And you'd be right, they are. But when you're talking about a volume of hundreds of thousands of arrests, even a tiny percentage adds up to a really significant number of incidents. We're still talking about thousands of allegations that have to be investigated.
So, let's pull all this together. What have we learned? Well, the data shows an immigration enforcement system running at a record-breaking level. It's been defined by a major strategic shift toward arresting people without criminal records, and all of this has created rising risks and consequences for everyone involved, both the people being detained and the officers enforcing the law. The data really paints a clear picture of an absolutely unprecedented period of enforcement. And it leaves us with a critical question for the future. What are the long-term effects of a system operating at this intensity on communities, on the agencies themselves, and on the country as a whole?
Now, let's take a look at what all of this is costing taxpayers in the United States. The amount of money spent is staggering. This money could have been spent on disabled veterans and homeless United States citizens.
Welcome to The Explainer. All right, let's just forget the political debates for a moment. Today, we're going to do something a little different. We're conducting a fiscal audit. We're just following the money, plain and simple.
You see the headlines all the time, right? But the real question is, where do those taxpayer dollars actually end up going? We're going to trace the money, from your local town hall all the way up to Washington, D.C. to find the answer. Okay, let's get into it.
To really get a sense of the scale we're talking about, let's just start with this number, $200 billion. That is the projected federal budget just for immigration enforcement and border control for fiscal year 2026. I mean, it's a staggering figure, but believe it or not, that's really only half the story.
But here's the thing. That huge federal number, that's not actually where the story begins. If you really want to understand the full fiscal picture, we've got to start way closer to home, in our towns and states, where these costs are felt first and, most directly.
Okay, so this really breaks down the core financial divide. It's kind of like two different ledgers. On one side, you've got your state and local governments. They're handling the day-to-day stuff, right? Schools, hospitals, emergency responders. But on the other side, you have the federal government, and they're focused almost entirely on enforcement, border control, and national security. Understanding the split, it's absolutely crucial.
And all that direct spending, well, it adds up. We're talking $19.3 billion. This is what budget analysts call a net fiscal cost. And what does that mean? Well, put simply, it means state and local governments are spending more on services for this group of people than they're getting back from them in taxes. It's an imbalance. So you might be asking, what's the single biggest driver of that local cost? Well, it's education. And here's the key. For states, it's not optional. There was this huge Supreme Court case back in 1982, Plyler v. Doe, and it mandated that all children have a right to a K-12 education no matter their immigration status. This essentially created what's known as an unfunded mandate. The feds make the rule, but they don't provide the money to pay for it.
And the fiscal impact of that one ruling? It is immense. We're looking at an estimated $68 billion a year just on K-12 schooling for these kids. And since most public schools get their money from local property taxes, well, you can see how that cost falls directly onto the shoulders of local communities.
Okay, so let's switch gears. We're going to move away from the local level and open up the federal books. And what you'll see is that the spending priorities are, well, they're completely different. We're not talking about legal mandates anymore. Now we're talking about something called discretionary spending. This is money that Congress chooses to spend based on what it thinks the national priorities are.
And what you see in recent years, especially looking at the 2025-2026 budget cycle, is that federal spending on enforcement hasn't just, ticked up a little bit. No, it has surged dramatically. This isn't an accident. It's a deliberate, significant policy choice to pour more resources into this area than ever before.
And if you want a perfect example of this, just look at the budget for ICE. That's Immigration and Customs Enforcement. I mean, look at this. You can see the pre-2025 levels compared to what's projected for fiscal year 2026. The funding has basically tripled. Tripled!
So yeah, that tripling brings ICE's budget to a new high of around $30 billion. And I want you to let that sink in for a second. The budget for this one single federal agency is now bigger than the direct spending on services by all states and localities combined. That's a huge shift.
And this is where things get really interesting, because it brings us to this fascinating paradox. Check this out. Projections are showing that for the first time in 50 years, net migration is expected to be negative, right? So more people are actually leaving than arriving. And yet, at the exact same time, federal spending on enforcement is shooting up to an all-time high. It's a real head-scratcher.
But you know, a good audit always looks beyond the headlines, right? You got to check the fine print. Those big budget items, education and enforcement, they don't tell the whole story. So now, let's dig into some of the costs and complexities that you won't always find on the main ledger.
Okay, so this is probably one of the biggest questions people have in this whole conversation. And like pretty much everything else on our audit, the answer, it's a little more complicated than a simple yes or no.
So here's the nuance. The adults themselves, if they're undocumented, are generally not eligible for federal welfare. But, and this is a big but, the data shows that 59% of these households do receive benefits. So, how does that work? Well, it's almost always through a U.S. citizen child in the family or another household member who is a legal resident. They're the ones who qualify for programs like SNAP or Medicaid, and that's how the household gets access.
And it's not just about direct payments. There's also the strain on our public infrastructure. You know, the stuff we all use every single day. We're talking roads, sewers, police and fire departments. Fiscal analysts actually have a term for this. They call it the congestion effect.
Yeah, you can think of it as the unseen wear and tear on a town. More people means more cars on the roads, which means more maintenance. It means a greater demand on the water and sewer systems, and it can put a real strain on response times for police, fire, and EMTs. These are very real costs, and they definitely show up in city and town budgets.
Okay, so we've looked at the books, we've gone from local school districts all the way up to the federal enforcement agencies, we've talked about direct services and those hidden costs. So, what's the final tally? What's the auditor's bottom line here?
At the end of the day, our audit really points to this fundamental tension. It's like two opposing forces. On one side, you've got this local budget squeeze, and it's mostly driven by legal mandates like Plier v. Doe, things a town has no control over. But on the other side, you have this massive federal enforcement surge, and that's driven by discretionary policy choices being made in Washington.
So the big question is, what does this all add up to over the long term? Well, when researchers try to project these costs out over a person's entire lifetime, they come up with this bottom line. For one person, without a higher education, the estimated net cost to taxpayers is about $68,000. And that's where our audit leaves us. We can see that costs are going up pretty much everywhere, but for totally different reasons. At the local level, the money is flowing into mandated services, like schools. At the federal level, it's surging into enforcement, which is a choice. You see, an audit can only show you the numbers. The bigger question it leaves us with is all about our priorities. What is the right fiscal balance? How do we balance supporting the people who are already here with controlling who comes next?
Thank you for joining us today. Please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Grandma loves you.